Welcome to Mike and Mike Theology Plus, the podcast where we talk about all things related to Christian theology. Well, welcome to Mike and Mike Theology Plus, where theology matters. As you can tell, we're coming to you from the road. We are currently on our way back from Birmingham, Alabama to Charleston, South Carolina, where in Birmingham, we attended the reThink Apologetics Conference. Mike and I were a couple of the parent chaperones. We had a group of 28 total. How many teenagers? About 20?
Yeah, we had... about 20. About 20.
Yeah, I think we had about 8 adults or so, 20 kids. So we are on our way back to Charleston now. It is Sunday afternoon, and we thought that we would do a quick episode just to kind of recap the weekend that we had, go through a little bit of what we did, what we heard, what we thought.
Yeah, and to be honest, I would say I was minimally disappointed. The theme of it was, has God spoken? And I think like the centerpiece main talk was J. Warner Wallace and his presentation of how he came to believe the scripture is part of it. He's a forensic detective. He's been trained in eyewitness testimony, etc., etc. I've heard this talk before. It's very good. However, he had to have emergency surgery, so he wasn't there to give kind of the centerpiece talk to kick us off. And Abdu Murray came in and did a great job. But you know, it's not his talk.
Yeah.
You could tell that there were a couple of misfires with some of the presentation stuff. So I mean, was it good? Yeah, but I sure miss J. Warner Wallace.
Yeah, I guess coming into it, I was hoping there would be a little more than I heard on maybe how we get the Bible, the reliability of the scriptures. There was some of that, but it seemed to be the emphasis was in a different place than I was anticipating. But I agree with you. It was a good weekend. I wouldn't say that overall it was a disappointment, but it was not quite what I was expecting.
Yeah, I thought there might be some textual criticism, maybe use the long ending of Mark or the woman caught in adultery to talk about textual criticism and maybe why we wouldn't thunder on those passages. I happen to believe the woman caught in adultery is authentic history, but probably not canon, most likely not canon. Whereas the longer ending of Mark, there's some things in there that have always bothered me, and then when I learned that this was added on later, I'm like, okay, well that makes sense,
right? Yeah.
To what's going on here.
Yeah, I think the pericope adulterae is plausible, but I think I don't hold to it being canon. I think there are some real textual critical issues if you want to try to hold that it is.
Well, and not only does it show up in different places, but doesn't it show up in different gospels?
Yeah, it's different places in John. I think it's in Luke. It may show up in Mark one time. I think another time it's just in a collation of the gospels, and it just seems like it was kind of added in. So, Douglas Wilson in a book debate with James White on debating the text of the New Testament says, I know it's, did Jesus really do this? Of course he did. It just sounds like him. And I want to say, that's not how we actually do this,
Right, and I would agree with him. It does sound like him. It sounds like something Jesus would do, but, we could probably make up some stories that sound like Jesus, and that's not what your point is. That's not the test of canonicity.
Right. And just to be clear, in my opinion, the test of canonicity is, what did John write? What did he send out as his work? Not anything that was added later.
So that was the kind of an overview of reThink. What was your favorite? Did you have a particular talk that you liked the most out of?
Well, I did enjoy Abdu Murray's presentation of J. Warner Wallace's talk. Having come last year and heard J. Warner Wallace, I'd love to hear him do his own talk, because I think I can just imagine that as good as it was, it would be even better. The second talk Friday night on the 6 points of the unbelievable claims that the Bible makes and why they can be trusted, I enjoyed that one.
Can you remember all 6 of them? I know it's a supernatural fighter.
Yeah, fighter. It was
supernatural
I remember
changes.
the big finger is big claims.
Yeah. It answers big questions of life, right?
Right, yeah.
Pinky was
Prophecy.
supernatural. Was it prophecy or perseverance? Yeah. I have them all written in my notes.
Yeah, me too.
But it was good. And there were 3 different speakers that took 2 of those apiece.
Right.
So, I guess, not to steal thunder, which I know you probably would say that, my favorite was we sat down and I've gone to the Q&A. I went to the Q&A the first year with Greg Kokel, and it was actually Mark Z. I can't pronounce his last name. It's like Zurich or something like that. He's with Hugh Ross's group, Reasons to Believe. He's an astronomer. I didn't go last year, but we went this year, and it was Amy Hall and Tim Barnett, and I thought they did a really good job. They get like no
like
warning.
Cats.
Yeah, there's no warning of what question's going to be asked. And there was an atheist guy in there who I didn't realize he was an atheist at the time, because he was asking questions that a genuine believer could ask.
Yeah.
And I had seen him at Amy Hall's she had like a little ask me questions booth out in the foyer. I'd seen him there, and I thought, well, he's just a very interactive. Well, it turns out he's he's a very active atheist who's, I guess, almost seeking to disprove God. It didn't seem like he was really wanting to hear answers. He was more wanting to put in.
Did you gather
defeaters.
that by all of the interruptions that he did?
Yeah, he did interrupt quite a bit. But I thought they answered his questions good. There were some really kind of intramural questions. Calvinism, Arminianism came up a couple times, I think. Different flavors of it. One was on perseverance of the saints. One was on predestination.
Right. And, all Baptists are Arminian.
Yeah.
There was a girl who asked a question. She goes to the church where we were, which is Presbyterian, and seemed to think that Presbyterian means you have to be a Calvinist, which is largely historically true, though not entirely, and that to be a Baptist you have to be an Arminian, which in modern times is maybe largely true, but not how the SBC started. So I actually followed up with her afterwards and kind of said, hey, it's not quite so cut and dry. There are different subcategories.
Yeah, I grew up Baptist, and we had both in my church.
Well, if you go back to the roots of the Southern Baptist Convention, it was started by people who had basically the 1689 London Baptist Confession as their confessional document, and they were hardcore Calvinists. So that was interesting. I would say maybe my favorite session was the 5th one, which I didn't go to. No offense to Tim Barnett, that was his talk, but we continued some discussions from the Q&A breakout session through that 5th session, and got to talk with Chris, the atheist. I got to talk with a Pentecostal Arminian, and we discussed the issue of free will, which really turned into an issue of total depravity. They got to walk through a couple of different passages there. I don't think I convinced him of anything.
Yeah, I agree. He seemed to, again, have, like when he was asked, so he later asked about perseverance of the saints. He termed it as once saved, always saved. We kind of corrected that a little bit. And again, it's almost confirmation bias. They already knew what they believed.
Yeah.
They just wanted to give you the verses to support what they believed instead of, all right, well, is this a reasonable belief to hold? What are the pros? What are the cons, etc.
Right.
So,
But, I mean, I don't believe it's my job to convince people. I believe it's my job to give a winsome presentation of what I believe, and hoping that it's right. Then it's the Spirit's job to sanctify God's truth into people's hearts.
you have failed if you didn't convince them.
Oh, well, maybe I should give up podcasting then. I think I heard cheering through the video.
Oh, cheering! Yay! All right. Just thinking, are there any other? Well, if you've never been to a reThink conference, I would recommend it. There's one that they hold in Southern California. There's one that they hold in Dallas. This is the one in Birmingham, Alabama, which is the closest to us. We're just outside or inside the people who travel the farthest, because every year there's someone who comes from Missouri. It seems like they beat us. Last year there was someone who claimed they were from China, but they were actually like an exchange student.
Right.
And they had just come from some church in Birmingham. I'm like, okay, I don't think you can claim.
I think there was somebody that was there from Europe, though.
Yeah, maybe.
Legitimately.
Yeah. And then they're going to have another one, Minnesota? There's another one that's like up in the north area. I think it's Minnesota. But there's always a magician named Drew.
Yeah.
We're pretty sure that he needs an exorcism.
Yep. Some of the stuff that he did could only be powered by dark forces. And we got confirmation of that because one of the teens that came with us this time was the final participant, volunteer on stage. And either he paid her a lot of money to keep her mouth shut, or she really was not in on it.
Yeah, so we had some confirmation. And she had literally just spoke. Well, and this is the last one that they didn't get to freely choose something. They chose kind of at random out of a bag. And yes, at random. And she happened to be the one that didn't get eliminated. And it turns out that the Zac Efron that she pulled was but the Paris thing.
I thought Paris was on the poll.
No, she came up with the Paris thing on her own, right? Yeah, where some of our passengers in the back are verifying that the Paris thing was all on her own.
No.
Like he adds that, and then like he pulls down this thing and it says in Paris, and I'm like, and that was so. Not that this relates too much to Theology Matters, but there was this box that was hanging from the ceiling. Both of us got independently asked what we thought it was without us knowing, and we both answered it's probably some building capital fundraising box.
I was quite relieved to hear that it was related to dark magic instead of a building fund campaign.
But so at the very end, they lower this box, they open it. He hands the envelope directly to her. Like, it doesn't seem like there was any time for him to have written anything on it, done anything, and they lower the thing one fold at a time, and this information that they've been collecting throughout the 2 days is showing up on this piece of paper with Juliana's at the very end, which she had just said minutes ago. So it was I was impressed.
Obviously, he does a good job. I mean, he put a mouse in the box that had been hanging since Friday. Obviously, he's able to manipulate things.
Right.
And he did mention on Saturday midday or so that the answers are right in front of us. We just can't see them.
Right.
So, anyway. Anything from the cheap seats in the back? What'd you guys like this weekend?
Basically a testimony, and one of the breakout sessions was really powerful. It's great to see, because you look at a lot of people, the atheists and stuff, but the Muslim side and how they have a connection with that, and that's the biggest thing for them to get over flu. It's breaking away from ultimatum, and it's proving that the Bible is right, more in their heart they have to get away from it.
A lot of what he said,
Just speak up.
along the lines of what he said.
Okay.
Missy was saying something. What did you say?
I got to see the talk with the cameraman who lost his 3-year-old son, and he was talking to kids about, when that hard time comes, because that was his worst nightmare. He's like, I literally would wake up in sweats before this happened, that this would break my faith, and it didn't. And he goes, there was times that I yelled and screamed to God, not at God, but to God, of my feelings, like, why did this happen? But then he would bring the scripture back to me and say, I am all-knowing, I am good, I am just. This is pain, feel your pain, but move through it. And to tell a bunch of teens that it's okay to feel your pain and not just be dismissive of it was just really eye-opening to the group that was in there. And the Q&A for him was really neat because, like teenage breakups, most adults are like, oh, it's fine, in 20 years you won't even care. But he's like, that's raw pain to you. It's okay to feel that pain. It's okay to tell God that you have pain, when a lot of societies just pushes them to the side.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Just to add on to what Missy said, I think if you're reading James, he talks about people who have plans and there's no allowance for God to intervene in those plans. And I don't think the takeaway from those passages is don't have plans, or not even to not want your plans to be interrupted, but when God does interrupt your plans, which he does from time to time, that you trust him that, okay, you are God, I am not God. You're smarter than I am, you're gooder than I am, and you have a plan that you're working, and it's not always his plan for our life, but our life for his plan. And so sometimes he interrupts our life with difficult things. Sometimes we figure out what he's doing, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we never know what are you working through this? We don't know. But we can trust him, and we know ultimately 2 Corinthians 4 says we do have momentary light affliction, but we're building up for ourselves an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison, and that we're to focus on the things that we can't see, not the temporal things that we can see. So yeah, sometimes God, you learn those lessons a really tough way, like that the cameraman did.
He said it was the hardest lesson he's ever had to learn, because he kept saying, well, that will break my faith. That's the only thing that could ever break my faith, is losing my child. And he goes, and God taught me that nothing can break my faith. And he goes, it was a very hard lesson to learn, because he's 5 years out now from the passing of his son. But he's like, never tell God this would break my faith, because he will prove to you that it doesn't. And sometimes it's a really hard pill to swallow.
That reminds me of one of the other conversations I had during the 5th session was with a young man named Jacob, who seemed to be having some raw pain based on some breakdown in the family and some bad choices that his brother had made. And he was asking, why would God allow this? Why didn't God keep him from making these poor choices? And, the truth is I had nothing concrete to tell him. I didn't have an answer to say, oh, well, for sure God is doing this and this is going to come out. And we aren't given that kind of information. And yet, as I'm sure the cameraman would say, what we can go back to are the bedrock truths of God is good, his word is true, and Jesus is a perfect Savior. And when we delve into the things that Deuteronomy 29:29 says are the hidden things of the Lord, I don't think it's wrong to wonder about those things. I don't think it's wrong to ask the questions, but I think we need to be content to not get answers to everything that we want to know, and just be willing to continue walking on with God and be content that He is good and that Romans 8 is true, that He will work everything for the good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose.
Yeah, the only thing I would, if we're done with that topic, I was going to mention, I did see a little bit of the presentation that we did miss, and with the most of, and I've seen that presentation in the past, and it's basically this idea that science and faith, or science and Christianity, don't mix. And Tim Barnett does a good job illustrating that really it was Christianity that was the science starter. And there's all these lists of well-known scientists: Newton, Kepler, Galileo, Maxwell, Pascal, Boyle, and it was more than that, who were all believers, and not just like nominal believers. If you read Sir Isaac Newton's work, he, is a huge believer, and he dedicates his work to God, and he, motivated by his faith. So he's just showing that, science is not opposed to Christianity. And I think this is in the church. I remember we had some Apollos meetings where we were talking kind of through this, and there was this idea that, well, we have to reject science. And I had repeated the line, I don't even know who said it. I think it was Frank Turek said, science doesn't say anything. It's scientists who say stuff, and our modern day scientists are looking at the same data that we look at and coming to different conclusions in some areas. And so we can challenge them in those areas. But the actual practice of science itself, just trying to learn about God's natural world, is not at all opposed to faith and Christianity. And Tim Barnett compares and contrasts just that methodology, where we're looking for the best answer for what we see going on in nature, to where we would say there's a methodological naturalism, and it's basically that any problem that we look at, we're always going to look for a natural explanation. And so scientists, which is fine if you're looking for a natural explanation for a log burning up, but if scientists starts dealing with some of our creation, the origin of life, forensic type stuff, like even in a crime scene, that's a forensic science. Sometimes all of that stuff can be explained by natural causes. You find a dead person, you can explain it by natural things. Sometimes it's an agent that causes those crime scenes. And so the same way with some of our sciences, sometimes we look at the origin of species, and there's not going to be a good natural explanation for that. It points to an agent, which we would call a creator or God. So I think that's a great talk. It's something that needs to be heard by both the Christian and the atheist, to show that these don't, while we may draw different conclusions, it's not like these things can't be put together.
Yeah, I think part of the need to hear that is because we live in a day where it seems to me like a lot of people have lost sight of what science is, what it does, and what it cannot do. And if you dispute conclusions based on data that has been captured, you frequently are just called some sort of a denier. And so then there's no ability to discuss the data and to evaluate the conclusions to say, is this a valid conclusion or not? If the conclusions are just presumed to be true, then you've actually ceased doing science, and you're now into the realm of faith.
Right.
And that reminds me of one of my favorite lines came from Abdu Murray's cover of J. Warner Wallace's talk, which is, silly things are still silly, even if really smart people say them. And so yeah, I totally agree with you. We do not need to be afraid of science at all. This world is governed by laws that are so steady because they were made by a God who values order and not chaos. So, we should feel completely free to go out and study and examine and get to know His world better, catalog it, define it, and come to learn from it and what we can do in it. That there's nothing about that that's in any way objectionable to Christianity.
Right, and there was this prevailing theory in the early 1900s that is called, I can't think of what it's called. I'll remember it since we're done. But it was a philosophical theory that basically everything had to be, if a statement was not able to be validated empirically, then it was a nonsensical statement. So either your statements were true, false, or nonsensical. And this held sway for a long time until that statement that I just made, someone pointed out, well, that's not able to be verified empirically.
So it's nonsensical.
Yeah, so it's nonsensical. But some of the heart of that lives on in what people refer to as scientism. And there was even a debate where there's an atheist and a Christian, where the atheist said, well, what do you I believe everything can be proven by science. And the Christian said, well, do you think that scientists should report their lab experiments accurately and truthfully, or do you think they should fudge them so that they can get published in a paper? That can't. He said, well, I think they should report them honestly. That's not verifiable by science. So there are things that are outside the realm of science.
Well, I mean, the problem with that perspective is if you take that perspective, you have completely ruled God out before doing any investigation at all. Right. It's the
and the things that science has to lay on, like the philosophy of science, like how do we do science? What do we agree even is science or qualifies? None of that can be verified by science itself.
Right. Well, and whose theory was it that a miracle is by definition the least likely explanation? Is that David Hume?
Well, Hume was the guy that I thought you were talking. So there was a more recent person that got quoted that basically reformulated what David Hume said. But yes, but David Hume has said similar things to that.
Right. I mean, so by definition, any explanation is more probable than a miracle. Well, you've just now made miracles impossible.
Right.
You've defined them out of existence without determining whether they could possibly exist or not. You're just saying they don't.
And one of the speakers this weekend pointed out that that's actually circular reasoning, because you're assuming the end in one of your first premises. This guy came along, last name was Bayes. He developed the Bayesian theory of probability, and he wasn't trying to do anything with Christianity or miracles. He was just trying to formulate the probability of some event occurring based on known historical background data. And so there's this equation that we won't go into for the non-math types. But anyways, you can use that equation to show that, well, miracles actually, you can show that they have a high probability of being the answer to some explanation. Anything else you want to talk about from reThink?
I don't think so.
All right. Anything else from the passengers?
We're good.
Okay. Well, I think we'll call this one a wrap.
So, we'll leave you with this. Think well,
Walk humbly,
love mercy,
and do justice. Thanks.
Bye.
You've been listening to Mike and Mike Theology Plus, the podcast where we talk about all things related to Christian theology.